Alright, so hopefully you've already worked on this problem, so let's talk about the answers a little bit. Now, once again, I'll have to point out this is an excellent test kind of question because there's a lot of analysis going on with it. But basically, here's some of the numbers so we can take a look at, just talk a little bit about things. And so if we look in this section right here, this is where we did our annualized returns. And you will see that the active 5-year mean return, the 10-year, the 15-year mean returns, they're all less than what the S&P 500 would give. So if I go and look at these, the difference between active and passive being the S&P 500, is we're looking at about 1.5 points. Typically, they're doing worse than the S&P 500. So I would think right there that that's kind of, hey, you're doing this, you're looking at it, but you're not doing as well as just dumping money into the S&P 500. So this could be a cause for concern, looking at it going, hey, why am I going to give you money when I could just buy into the S&P 500? So let's take a look at the correlation coefficients. So once again, remember, these are the numbers that sit there and they tell us what the relationship between the data is. So if I have a positive correlation coefficient, that means that as the annualized returns go up, the manager's tenure should go up. If I have a negative correlation, that means as the returns go up, the manager tenure goes down, which means that the shorter time the manager has been managing the fund, the higher the returns. Now, as we look at these between the 5, the 10, and the 15 year, we've got correlations. The biggest one we have is a positive 0.07, which is actually a pretty weak correlation. So once we're below that threshold of 0.3 and negative 0.3, there's not a lot of there. So we don't really have a lot going on. So basically, as I look at these with these correlation coefficients, I would sit there and go, you know what? There really does not appear to be a relationship between the annualized returns and the tenure. What about expense ratio, though? So if we go down and look at these expense ratio, these are different. So once again, this is the 5, 10, and 15 year. My sheet's a little bit off. If I look at the 5-year return, I've got a negative 0.22. The 10 years a negative 0.4. The 15 years a negative 4.5. Those are showing a correlation. They're showing a pretty decent one. Even that 0.22 is like, okay, there's a correlation there. It's a little bit on the weak side, but it is a correlation. But that 0.4 and that 0.45, those are fairly strong correlations. So what is that telling me? It is negative. So that means as my expense ratio goes up, my annualized returns are going down. So looking at this here, what this is telling me is the more expensive, the more that we spend into a mutual fund with a higher expense ratio, the less amount of returns that we're going to get out of it. So we've got that going on. Now, so what does that mean? Well, that means the expense ratio, that money that you're paying on it, is actually eating into the returns that you're going to get. And so, in fact, here are 2 scatter plots that we look at. They kind of plot that. And you can see right here, this is the line, the regression line for the return and manager tenure. And you'll see that's relatively flat. And like we said, looking at the number, there's not much of a relationship there. Now, if we go over here to the expense ratio, you can see there is definitely a downward line there. So there is some kind of relationship between the expense ratio and the annualized return. So this is all really interesting data that we get out of things. And so up here, if you want to check your numbers, this is what I have for those annualized 5, 10, and 15 year returns. And so let's just take a look at things right here. You can see through these, the mean's relatively pretty constant, 946, 1019, 999, nothing really exciting or interesting there. Same thing with the median. It's sitting right about 10, so not much going on. Standard deviations, 1.65. So as we're looking at that, out of all of these, the interesting thing to note is we can see at the 5-year, they're a little bit more spread out than they are at the 15-year. So the 15-year, definitely a lot less movement, a lot less movement around the median, a lot less spread out, so definitely a lot tighter than in the 5 years. And same thing, we get that, remember kurtosis, we talked about it. What is that? That is how fat the ends of our graph are. And so the larger the kurtosis number, the more extreme values we have. So you can see at the 5-year, a kurtosis value of 3 is almost double. It actually is double what we have at their kurtosis at the 15-year. So that means we've got some more extreme values when we're looking at the 5-year mark as opposed to the 15-year mark. And so all of these have a negative skew to them. And once again, the skew goes down as we go. So we got a -1 skew here, -0.9 skew, so roughly the same. But then again, once we hit the 15-year, the data is not as skewed as extremely once we get down to that 15-year point. The other one to note here is we can see, once again, the range is tightening up, and this should make sense since our standard deviation is reducing. A range of 11.65% to 10.45% to 8.2%. So we have all of these numbers here that show us that while the returns and everything on the 15-year may not be as good as the S&P 500, they are better than the 5 and the 10-year because there's less variation within the data. And in fact, if we go back here and we look at the active and passive differences, we can see the 5 and the 10-year, the active and passive difference is -1.6%, while we get down to the 15-year is -1.22%. So it's a little bit tighter of a band and a little bit closer to the S&P 500. So what is the conclusion from all of this is the way that I look at the data anyway. I would say that, hey, I think I'd rather take the S&P than an actively managed fund. And more importantly with that, I would take a fund with lower expense ratios than anything, because it shows that from the data that the higher the expense ratio goes, the less amount of returns that we're going to have. So these are the kind of things that you should be looking for as you're looking at this data set. And you should be getting similar numbers and similar graphs, whether you did this in Excel, Python, or Tableau. So if you got all of this stuff, doing it on your own, that's great. You should be in a good spot. If you've come up with kind of the same conclusions, you're definitely along the right way and thinking about data in the correct way. If you had some problems with this or you had some mistakes, contact me and let's talk about it and figure out kind of what's going on with that. Okay, other than that, that's what we had for this exercise today. Here's the answers. If you had any problems, please let me know, and I will see everyone in class.